and I hope you are enjoying your day. We're back with another installment of our 50 questions on Jewish life and observance. And today is an interesting one, especially with all that's going on in the world. So, why does the Torah permit slavery? Okay, so that's the question. Please, as usual, please comment. Let us know where you're watching from. Let us know where you're tuning in from. If you have any questions or comments, please join the conversation. Feel free to comment. Let us know you're here with us. Hey, Chayela. Thank you for joining us. And be a part of the conversation. So the question is, why does the Torah permit slavery? After all, didn't we mention on Friday that God created all people in divine image? Did he not command the Jews never to forget their slavery in Egypt? To never take their freedom for granted? Does not the Torah go out of its way to ensure human dignity and respect for all people? All roads seemingly lead to the abolishment of slavery. But God did no such thing in the Torah, and the question is why? And ironically, many abolitionists seem to have been motivated by religious conviction to abolish slavery. They were inspired not least by the biblical narrative of the exodus of Egypt and the mission of Isaiah to proclaim freedom for captives and to release prisoners from captivity. In addition, the abolitionists in the American colonies based their position largely on the statement in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This statement seems to have been inspired by the biblical claim that all men were made in divine image, that all humans are created in divine image. And in fact, the Lubavitcher Rebbe of blessed memory referred to Abraham Lincoln as Chasidei Umayis Ha'olam, the pious, the righteous amongst the Gentiles, and he said so based on the fact that because of the Emancipation Proclamation, as one of the reasons is why Abraham Lincoln was a righteous among the nation. So we see this concept of the abolitionists, the people that were for emancipation, were for freeing slaves, were inspired by the Torah. But the Torah makes no such claim. In fact, the Torah talks about slave ownership. The same Bible, the same Torah from where the abolitionists drew so much inspiration, explicitly allows slavery. And those who oppose abolition heighten this point. They said in the Bible there is slavery. How can God permit slavery, which is something that is seemingly so incompatible with the core values of his own Torah? The Torah believes in every human being being created in divine image. Why would there be slavery? It seems counter what the Torah stands for. Now, I want to just bring to the attention that the word that we're using here is the Torah permits slavery. And the word we want to use is permits. There is no mitzvah in the Torah to have a slave. It's not like Shabbat, where there's a mitzvah in the Torah to keep Shabbat, and you must keep Shabbat. It's not an option, and if you don't keep Shabbat, you're breaking the rules of the Torah. The Torah allows slavery. The Torah permits slavery, but there is no requirement for a Jew to own a slave. Okay? So we are going to discuss this concept of slavery, and try to understand why there is this idea of slavery in the Torah. So in the Torah, when you look at the Torah, you'll find two types of slaves. You'll find what we call an Eved Ivri, a Jewish slave, and also something called an Eved Kanani, a non-Jewish slave. Now, today we're not going to talk about the Jewish slave because the Jewish slave is a different kind of slavery. The Jewish slave was more like indentured servitude that existed in British colonies, which is the concept of you are only a slave for a limited amount of time. It was kind of a bridge in different reasons, either because somebody stole something and couldn't afford to pay it back, or somebody was very poor and couldn't take care of himself. The Torah allows a Jew to sell himself or be sold by the court. But a slave that's a Jew can only be a slave for a certain amount of years. It's not a eternal slavery. It's a slavery up to a certain point, a max of 6 years. 7th year, he has to go free. Okay? So that is the concept. And because it's not a full-time, lifelong slavery, that's not what we're going to be discussing today. What we're going to be discussing today is lifelong slavery. Okay? So we're going to take two approaches to this, two different ways of looking at this idea, and let's dive right in. So the question we have is, why does the Torah permit slavery? Seemingly, it seems to be counterintuitive, counter everything the Torah stands for, of dignity of all people being created in divine image. How does the Torah allow slavery? So, Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, he writes like this, and I'm going to read it to you. The consideration of certain circumstances is necessary to correctly understand the fact that the Torah presupposes and allows the possession and purchase of slaves from abroad to a nation itself just released from slavery. No Jew could make any other human being into a slave. He could only acquire by purchase people who by then universally accepted international law were already slaves. But this transference into the property of a Jew was the one and only salvation for anybody who, according to the prevailing laws of the nations, was stamped as a slave. So Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch says that in the Torah does not make people slaves. A Jew is not supposed to make a person a slave. A Jew doesn't make slaves. A Jew doesn't take a person and kidnap them or take them and sell them on the slave market. Jews were permitted, he says, Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, that Jews were permitted to buy slaves from other nations. That means people that were already in the slave market, already being sold as slaves by other people. In that situation, Jews were allowed to buy a slave. And Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch argues that this was actually a very tremendous benefit to the slave. That being bought by a Jew was a salvation for the slave, as we'll see momentarily. So he argues that Jews don't make slaves. Jews never took people and sold them into slavery. Jews only bought slaves that were already slaves by international law at that time. Mitch, happy Father's Day to you too, and thanks for joining us. So why was the transference of a slave to Jewish ownership one and only salvation for existing slaves at the time? Let's look at another text that elaborates on this idea from a Rabbi Ben Zion Uziel. And what he writes is like this, and I'll read to you what he writes and then we'll discuss it. There are those who scoff at the Torah of Israel for its permitting the purchase of Canaanite slaves. But had these scoffers been wise, they would have understood that this purchase was only permitted regarding those who were sold to their brothers as slaves. The purpose was to save them from their Canaanite brothers, who would work them cruelly and subjugate their bodies to the point of death. With this, we can understand the Talmudic law that if a Jewish master sold a slave to an idolater, the master would be forced to buy him back at up to 10 times the market worth, write him a writ of manumission, and let him go. The Torah of Israel did not permit even the servitude of a Canaanite without setting many strict limitations for the benefit of he who had been sold into lifelong bodily servitude, having fallen into the hands of his Canaanite brothers. This saved him from abusive domination of his body and soul and transferred him to the hands of Israel, who would treat him kindly and compassionately. So essentially, Rabbi Ben Sion is arguing, he's saying, is that Jews don't make slaves. Jews never took slaves and put them on the market. Jews bought slaves that were already slaves from other people. And Jews treated their slaves much better. There are many laws in the Torah of how to treat a slave, and Jews treated slaves much better than anybody else in the world. And therefore, when the Jewish people, when a slave was bought by a Jew, it was a form of salvation from much greater servitude and subjugation of his body and soul to abusive behavior and things like that. And as we see that if a Jewish slave owner sold his slave back to a Gentile, back to the Canaanites, the Torah would force him, Jewish law would force him to buy back the slave even at 10 times the price and then release him, kind of preventing us from selling slaves back to non-Jewish owners because they treated them so unfairly. So essentially, from the Torah perspective, these two opinions, Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch and Rabbi Ben Sion Uziel, he says that the Torah's view of slavery is not the ideal. On the contrary, the Torah acknowledges that slavery is a negative phenomenon that can lead to terrible abuse when this power falls into the wrong hands. Though permitting Jews to acquire slaves, the Torah mitigated that the injustice and abuse of these slaves, for in Jewish tradition, proper treatment of slaves was very, very important. Okay? So essentially the Torah says it's not the ideal situation and you shouldn't sell someone into slavery. You could only buy somebody from slavery because essentially, as the Torah saw it, was a huge upgrade from the situations and life they were subjugated to when they were slaves under Canaanite rule. And Rabbi Zadok Khan, says that if you look at the Jewish history, you'll see that there was no such situation as Spartacus. In Jewish life, there was no time when the slaves, although Jews owned slaves never revolted. In other parts of the world and other slave owners, slaves at times tried to revolt against their slave owners. Not necessarily always successful, or most times unsuccessfully, but there was documentation of slaves trying to abandon, trying to rise up and fight for themselves. Whereas in Jewish history, we don't find that. And he argues that this is because the Jewish slaves were treated not like slaves, much more like laborers, like workers. Like they weren't treated and subjugated to such harsh, cruel conditions as typical slaves were. They had much more rights and much more freedoms, if you will, than normal for that type of time. So let's read from Rabbi Zadok Khan, what he writes. He writes, there is no society in the world in which slaves found such kindness and love of humanity as in that of the Jews. Aside from the decisive proof implicit in the laws themselves, and aside from the heart-capturing deeds of kindness and compassion described in the Talmud, there is one thing that verifies the true nature of our claim in the best way. That is seen in the fact that in all of recorded Jewish history, one does not find even the faintest trace of complaint from slaves, not even the smallest attempt at an uprising against their masters, when at the same time there were revolts that caused devastation in other lands. So he argues that you don't see this because they were treated very, very well. So just to summarize this first opinion, the first way of looking at it, is according to Rabbis Hirsch and Uziel, the Torah does not view slavery as an ideal. The Torah allowed the acquisition from someone who was already a slave in order to save them from the owners who would work them cruelly, as opposed to Jewish slave owners who were known to treat slaves with kindness and compassion. Now let's see it from another perspective, another avenue. A contemporary rabbi named Rabbi Nachum Eliezer Rabinowitz presents another perspective on our question. But he first wants to tell us the role of the Torah. Okay? And I'll quote from you, and this is what he tries to show you, how the Torah has dual parallel running tracks. Okay? What I mean by that, you'll see in a moment. The system of the Torah and the commandments is twofold. On the one hand, it conveys concept, instills eternal values, and directs people to the service of God at the highest levels and to the formation of society worthy to be the bearer of God's presence. On the other hand, it encompasses legislation and commands to combat the forces of evil and destruction that erupt within the individual soul and the nation's spirit. Given each generation's situation and social, economic, and cultural circumstances prevalent at any given time and place. For the first objective, the Torah places before us lofty goals that challenge and motivate us, for even the noblest of people cannot attain them in full. At the same time, it establishes for a second objective a minimum standards for conduct that people can, as practical matter, accept and that are needed to avoid endangering the survival of the individual and society, and to enable them the possibility of a spiritual uplift. So the concept Rabbi Menachem Eliezer Rabinowitz says is the Torah has very, very lofty goals that are very difficult to attain even by the most holy people. It sets a very, very, very high standard and bar. At the same time, the Torah is practical. It wants a person to grow on their level. And even if you can't achieve the ultimate dream, you still are supposed to be growing, and the Torah kind of has the best way to do things and then the bare minimum of what you need to do to be living a godly life. And you have these two tracks, so to speak, in Judaism: the goal, the high bar set by the Torah, the noble goal, which so one should strive for, but ultimately could be sometimes out of reach. At the same time, there's very practical goals, things that you can do that at a bare minimum you must keep to be living a godly life. And he continues, developing this idea when it comes to slavery. The original person was created a single individual in order to promote peace among people. So no person could say to another, my progenitor is greater than your progenitor. For creation itself, the Torah teaches us that all people are truly equal. Yet the Torah recognizes the institution of slavery. On the one hand, there is no clearer declaration than the creation of one man, which underscores our equality, and the declaration that all people, slaves and masters alike, are created in the divine image. On the other hand, the Torah states, from them you shall purchase slaves and maidservants, and they shall be your possession. So you see, on the one hand, the Torah is arguing that all people are created equal, and the reason why God created only one human being is that nobody should be able to say they're better than anybody else. We're all truly the same, all truly equal, all sons of Adam and Eve, all sons and daughters of Adam and Eve. At the same time, the Torah does allow slavery. How does that make any sense? This is an instance where Maimonides' principle is relevant. Out of concern over what people by their nature could not accept, God did not mandate the ideal path, which was the primary goal. Given the circumstances, the Torah did not require the principle be applied in full from the outset. Rather, it taught society to advance gradually until the goal could be fully achieved. This point is clearly made in the Sifra, lest you say, whom shall we employ? Scripture therefore states, slaves and maidservants that may be yours from amongst the nation. In the ancient world, it was almost impossible to sustain a proper economy without vast amounts of human labor, and that human labor was usually recruited from slaves. The leading thinkers among the nations could not convince the leading thinkers among the nations could not conceive of a successful society without bounded servants. As a matter of economics, it was simply impossible. Whom shall we employ? Was a serious question that could not be avoided. The Torah revolutionized this institution of slavery. It set out certain fundamental principles that could not be violated, and that set a floor that prevented descent to the vile conduct of surrounding nations. For example, in contrast to laws of other nations, the slave's life did not become the master's property, but remained in possession of the master, but remained in the possession of the master for all. As it says, if a man strikes his slave or his maidservant with a rod, causing death, death shall be avenged. Similarly, although the slave must labor for a master, the Torah remains concerned about the slave's soul. The Sabbath is a sacred not only for masters but also for slaves. Despite the limitations, the institution of slavery remained, for the prevailing conditions precluded its abolition. So the concept basically is that what Rabbi Nachum Eliezer Rabinowitz is arguing, he's saying that the ideal role of the Torah is not to have slaves. But the Torah understood, God understood that the people at that time were not ready for that. That economies, that life revolved around slavery. And therefore the Torah said, okay, you can't get away from slavery? That's fine for now. Ultimately we will get away from it. But for now, make sure that you are treating your slaves with respect. Treating your slaves, they're not your possession in the sense where no one can come after you. They're not just your property, and if you kill them, God forbid, nothing happens to you. Or if you hurt them, God forbid, nothing happens to you. In Judaism, if you killed a slave, you were guilty of murder. And in Judaism, if you hurt a slave and you broke a bone or did something like that, the slave would go free. Treatment of slaves, ethical treatment of slaves, and even, for example, on Shabbat, where a Jew is supposed to rest on Shabbat, a Jew had an obligation to allow their slaves to have a day off as well and rest. So it was he argues it was God, so to speak, giving in and allowing the Jews at the time to evolve out of this concept of owning slaves slowly. Take one step, take another step, and grow. Rabbi Rabinowitz also implies that the complete abolition would be preferable. However, he gives a different reasoning for why the Torah permitted slavery. According to the first opinion we gave before, or the first way of looking at it, Rabbi Hirsch and Rabbi Uziel, the Torah allowed slavery primarily due to the immoral circumstances of slavery by other nations, and allowed Jews to buy slaves to get them out of that, to do them a favor, to bring them better living conditions. Slavery was allowed for the good of the non-Jewish slaves who would otherwise be treated unfairly. According to Rabbi Rabinowitz, permitting slavery was primarily due to the then compromised state of the Jewish people as well as the rest of the world. The Jews were not yet ready to live without slaves. The Torah sets forth the grand idea and high morals of all people being created equal and everybody and offside that God, but the reality is that the Torah tells us that God only asks us according to our abilities. So God definitely asked us to do things that are beyond our comfort zone, but they are not impossible. And we therefore try our best to execute these actions, but at that stage, not having slaves was too much to ask for, and therefore the Torah put in lots of rules, lots of regulations, lots of laws pertaining to slaves and not an ethical treatment of the slaves, and didn't abolish it completely. But ultimately, all the rabbis agree that ultimately slavery should be abolished, and that's why for the latter many years you won't see the concept of slavery amongst Jewish people, and no Jewish rabbi or no Judaism today doesn't profess that slavery should be allowed, etc., because we know that ultimately, as the Torah tells us, all humans were created in the image of God. We all have the same progenitor, Adam and Eve, and no one is better than anybody else from that respect, and therefore all people should be treated equally, and slavery, it needs to be a thing of the past. And this is exactly what happened. Ultimately, Judaism went away from slavery, and now we have a much better world. So key points just to wrap up. According to Rabbis Hirsch and Uziel, the Torah allowed the acquisition of existing slaves to save them from the Canaanite owners who would work them cruelly, as opposed to Jews who were known to treat slaves with kindness and compassion. And the Torah, and the second way of looking at it is the Torah sets forth grand ideals to strive towards, but it also acknowledges reality. Rabbi Rabinowitz asserts that because the Jewish people were not yet ready to live without slaves, the Torah permitted slavery in a very limited way, with the aim that they would eventually be weaned off of this practice, as we are today. Thank you all for joining us. I hope you got some insight. And next time you read the Torah and you see this concept of slavery, you'll have a little bit more information about it. And I hope you enjoyed today's installment of our journey through 50 questions about Jewish life and tradition. Tomorrow's question we're going to be dealing with is, why does Jewish law obsess over details? Right? You eat matzah, not just eat matzah, you got to eat a specific amount of matzah. You put a mezuzah on your door, you can't just put a mezuzah on your door, it's got to be in a specific spot. Every single thing we do is so detailed and so regulated to the last detail. And the question is, why does Jewish law obsess over details? So please join us tomorrow here on Facebook Live. It's also streaming on YouTube at youtube.com/Chaim Lipsker, or you just go to YouTube and search for Chaim Lipsker, and it streams live on YouTube as well as on Twitter or Periscope. We're there as well. Please join us tomorrow. And yes, otherwise, as usual, daily reminder of our annual summer raffle that we're running right now throughout the whole summer. Well, not the whole summer, till July 22nd. We have a goal to sell 1,500 tickets. As of Friday, we sold 483 tickets. That's almost a third of the way there. Every ticket that's sold goes to help students, Shabbat dinners, classes, counseling, chicken soup deliveries. It all goes to help students. You're investing in Jewish life on campus while getting a chance to win $10,000. Tickets for 2 to Israel, $1,000, $500, and $360. Those are all different prizes. And you can buy tickets and help Chabad, help Jewish students, help Jewish life at UCF, and get a chance to win. But ultimately, you're already automatically a winner if you buy some tickets, because you win a mitzvah of helping Jewish life at UCF. So please go to jewishucf.com/raffle, jewishucf.com/raffle. Buy as many tickets as you can and encourage your friends and family to buy as well. There's 32 days left, still trying to sell just over 1,000 tickets, 1,017 tickets. So if you could help, that would be really, really awesome. It's a big mitzvah, and you'll be happy you did it when you see the smiles of students as they get their delicious Shabbat dinners, barbecues, and other great stuff on campus. Otherwise, thank you for tuning in. Thanks for watching. Hope you learned something. Please leave a comment. Let us know you're here, and let us know that you're enjoying. And we will continue doing these classes on a daily basis. A happy Father's Day to all the dads out there. I hope it's a big gift from Hashem to be a dad, and we should utilize our roles as dad as best as we can to be there for our families. And those that are looking forward and wishing to be dads, may God grant your prayers and wishes that this year you'll get your gift of becoming a dad. Otherwise, again, happy Father's Day.